Thank you for being here with me today. We're here to talk about the 12th house. This is, I think, my favorite subject in all of astrology. And I really love astrology. Like, I love all of it, but this is probably my favorite. And the 12th house is possibly the most complex of houses because there's such a wide range of different things that it entails. For example, in terms of life stages, it represents both the prenatal period before we're born, when we're in our mother's womb, and it also represents the final stage of life, the end of life, where people are making peace with death, essentially, and getting ready to make a transition. There's more to the 12th house than that, of course, but just in terms of the broad scope of the nature of the 12th house, I think that's a very telling comparison to make, or a very telling example of how broad the 12th house is. So essentially, the 12th house is where we lose ourselves. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing if you want to define things as good or bad. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But essentially, the 10th house is where we find our place in the world. The 11th house is where we change the world. And the 12th house is where we just let it all go. We're releasing everything that we expected, everything that we wanted, and just letting things be what they are, and surrendering with the faith that, one way or another it's going to be okay. Life goes on, and potentially, depending on whether it's, you could say like a higher or lower expression, there could be resignation instead of that spiritual surrender, resigning ourselves to things being, a way that we are judging is not okay. Some other lower expressions of the 12th house include escapism, helplessness, institutionalization. So like being admitted to a hospital for an extended period of time, being in jail, being in the military, being a part of any institution where your identity is really no longer relevant and you're pretty much helpless. You don't really get much of a say in what happens to you. Any of those things are 12th house organizations or experiences. There's also themes of addiction and mental health issues. So that could be depression. It could be even things like, anything where you're not processing reality the way it actually is or the way other people are seeing it. So delusions, or even like hallucinations, things like that can be part of what the 12th house entails. However, it can also be about things like finding inner peace or experiencing oneness with the universe, knowing that I am the universe. It can also involve just radically accepting the moment for what it is. So let's talk a little bit about the relationship between the 9th house and the 12th house, because I think this is important to talk about in terms of understanding the 12th house, because there's a natural square between them. So in the 12th house, we talk about spirituality, belief systems. We have this concept of like how life works, and other Sagittarian themes along those lines. And the 12th house, interestingly, is also about spirituality in a way, but because there's a square there, there's some kind of challenge or some kind of frustration between the two. It's not the same thing. So how's it different? What makes Sagittarius and Pisces different, or more specifically for this session, the 9th house and 12th house? The 9th house is all about discovery and trying to make sense of all of it. And then the 12th house is about releasing that, letting it go. Whatever your beliefs are about how life works, just let it go and just flow with whatever happens. It's more mystical in nature. It's all about just riding the wave of the experience and just seeing where it takes you. And that's a really important distinction when it comes to looking at the spiritual nature of the 12th house, because it's not about understanding. It's about letting go of understanding. It's about letting go of everything, really. So how is it that people find themselves in this situation where they can experience peace and radical acceptance in situations where they're helpless? One thing that comes to mind is the 12-step program. So like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, or like any kind of anonymous meeting like that, any kind of 12-step program has a very 12th house approach to the subject, because the first step is just admitting that your life has become unmanageable, and that you just have no control over whatever is happening, whatever, if it's alcoholism, then which is a very 12th house thing, by the way. If it's alcoholism, then you just admit, like, okay, my life has become unmanageable. My drinking is unmanageable. I have no control over this. It's just a problem, and I cannot manage this. So what they have you do essentially is turn control over to a higher power. You release the problem and everything else, release it all, and just give yourself to your higher power, whatever that may be. They say it doesn't really matter what it is, you could use a chair if that is what works for you, as long as, like, in your mind, it's, this concept of a higher power. And that's one example of the type of spiritual surrender that is a very 12th house thing. AA actually, or 12-step programs actually have something called the Serenity Prayer that they like to use in their literature and during their meetings. And the short version of it is, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So essentially, I see the 12th house as being the part where you hope to have the serenity to accept the things you cannot change, because when it comes to 12th house matters, in a way, you are helpless. All you can really do is decide how you're going to cope with that, essentially, if even that. I think most neuroscientists would say even that is, there's some determinism there with that as well, according to neuroscience. But in any case, so essentially, the first house or the 6th house could be the courage to change the things you can, depending on what that change looks like. And both have an important relationship with the 12th house, but the serenity to accept the things you cannot change, that's a big part of the 12th house. And then sometimes escapism, distracting yourself from it. That's what a lot of people do, or trying to numb it out because it's painful. Very common thing. But in AA, or any 12-step program, they actually like have it, written out, these 12 steps that detail, how it works there. And that first one, just admitting that it's become unmanageable, your life has become unmanageable, is a good example of how the 12th house works. So how do you find this kind of peace with the way things are? You just come to a point where you realize, like, there's nothing I can do. I really am helpless in this situation. And once you get there, and really stare at that and sit with it, it can become an area of resignation, like, well, there's nothing I can do. I guess it's just gonna suck. I'm gonna have to deal with this. Or it can be a peaceful thing, like, well, I don't see how I'm getting out of this, and I don't see how it's going to be okay, or I don't know what's going to happen, but there's really nothing I can do, and whatever happens, I'm just going to go ahead and go through with it. Just, it's happening, I'm here. Just accepting that's where the peace comes in. So there isn't much peace in resignation. It essentially comes down to what you believe is going to happen. If you're willing to accept that you don't know what's going to happen, now you've got peace. If you want to believe that you know what's going to happen and that it's a bad thing, that's the resignation. So the 12th house, it's about letting go. It can be a very powerful thing because the first house follows the 12th house. So while you're fighting a losing battle with, whatever it is that you're fighting, and not wanting to acknowledge the situation for what it is, or not wanting to acknowledge that you feel the way you do about it, not wanting to acknowledge that there's just really nothing that you can do, and whatever is going to happen is going to happen. It can be a very powerless place because you're acting from a place of delusion, or you're acting from a place of illusions. However, once you let go of those, once you just release that and just be present with whatever you're experiencing in the situation at that moment, and stop trying, just let it go. What can happen, what usually happens in that situation, is there's a moment of it's just sinking in, and then there's peace, and then you can just be with that peace, and then all of a sudden, first house, the cycle continues. It restarts with the first house. Like, okay, I've accepted that the situation is what it is, and now that I'm clear on that, now that I truly am, where I am, now that I can see what's happening, and I'm not trying to make it what I want it to be. Now you are in a different position. A lot of times you're in a place of power now. Even like accepting your helplessness gives you some power, because now you are in a position to flow with the situation in a different way, or you're in a situation where you can just give up on whatever you were doing and get a fresh start. Like, okay, well, there's nothing I can do in this situation. I guess I just have to accept that the loss of the situation. And then once you've done that, there can be a reset. Like, okay, so now I can head in this direction. Very, very Aries energy to that. And Aries is the natural ruler of the first house. And I actually see this as this rebirth that happens in the first house or with Aries as being something that's often attributed to the 8th house. So what happens is there's this natural trine between the 8th house and the 12th house. So energy very naturally moves from the 8th house to the 12th house. So the 8th house in Scorpio are often attributed with transformation and, figurative deaths and rebirths. But I think that figurative death actually happens in the 12th house, and then the rebirth is actually a first house thing that, just naturally follows the 12th house. So the reason that the 8th house is so relevant to this process is because the 8th house is where we feel that pain, because people don't surrender when it seems like things are going the way they want them to, right? Like when it seems like there's a chance to do things our way or to continue to make things the way we want them to be, or it's not that bad, we can continue to like stay in the situation, or the situation hasn't really actually ended yet. Like part of the 8th house is dealing with loss and grief. And while we're still clinging, that's what the 8th house is about. The 8th house is about that, clinging, about that, it's Scorpio, the natural ruler of the first house, is about fixed water, fixed feelings. So the clinging, that wanting things to be a certain way, that, the intensity. And the 8th house is very deep. It's about, looking inside yourself and seeing things that you don't want to see or don't usually see, haven't seen before. It's about that like inner exploration, or looking into whatever's beneath the surface. So just being there with that and experiencing that and acknowledging the pain for what it is, and just feeling that pain very, very naturally leads to the 12th house acceptance and release of whatever it was because of the trine. So the 8th house is the actual clinging and the pain, and then the figurative death happens, in my personal opinion as an astrologer, happens in the 12th house, and then there's the figurative rebirth in the first house. But I found that going through these experiences, having some really, really, really difficult stuff to release and releasing it, and then getting that rebirth, and it's a surge of energy and it feels wonderful. It's very empowering, and it's a very beautiful experience all around. Like the whole thing is very beautiful once you do the 12th house acceptance. Having done a number of those, I realized like this is where it's at. Like this is the thing. This is what I need to do. So I would try to rush it. Like I'd get frustrated with something and say, okay, all I need to do is give up. Like hand it over to the universe. Or I heard somebody say once that he's got a God box. Like he called it a God box, and essentially just a shoebox that he like put a little hole on top of. And whenever he was really struggling with something, he'd write it down on a piece of paper and put it in the box. And that's his like release of it. Like, once it goes in the box, it's not his problem anymore. Now God gets to deal with it, or, give him some kind of guidance about what to do, or, whatever the situation is. So having figured out that, I didn't do that kind of thing. It was more just like releasing it to the universe or to life. Having done that, I would try to rush it. You know, I'd get a little frustrated with something, or, you know, I'd be a little bit hurt, and I'd be like, okay, all I got to do is give it up. And I'd be like, okay, I'm releasing this thing. I'm accepting the figurative death. And it only kind of works, like, if even, like, if you're not truly like at that point where you're like, there's just nothing I can do. Like, you know, like if you really haven't exhausted the struggle yet, then it doesn't really work to rush it. So I think before you can get to that point, you have to do the 8th house work. Like, yeah, like you can try to just, like, you know, start feeling something and be like, I don't want to feel this. I release it. I'm giving it up. But it doesn't really work unless you explore it a bit and be with it a bit. That doesn't necessarily mean like feeling it very strongly. There are methods of doing this kind of work without having to like get overwhelmed by the feelings. However, you do need to be present with them. Like, part of you can be like sharing with you what that experience is, and you can witness it and be present with it without actually like feeling it in your body as though it's happening to you, if that makes sense. Like you can feel it, you can feel where it's happening, but like it's not, it doesn't have the intensity of going through, just going through it. Ooh, I'm looking for terminology that's different from like the terminology that I learned to do this kind of work. Essentially, it's lovingly being there for yourself and the part of you that's carrying that painful energy, instead of feeling yourself as that part of yourself, identifying with it, and, you know, feeling the heaviness and intensity fully. And that can be rough on the nervous system, and it can also end up being addictive too, because there's an endorphin release that comes with that. And some people get addicted to pain and drama and that sort of thing when they're doing a lot of this type of experiencing. So somebody's asking in the chat where people are going to be able to watch the video later because she's got to go to work. I'm going to post the video in the group once it's done, so you'll be able to find that there. And thank you for joining while you were free to join. So I think what I would like to do is talk a little bit more about oneness, essentially. Like, it's such a beautiful experience, and the description of it isn't the thing itself. Like, you can't know it from the description. You can only know it by experiencing it. However, sometimes descriptions can be helpful to, you know, kind of like a map, or like if you have a photo of something that you're looking for and then you see it, you're like, okay, well, it's not exactly like the photo, but like there's enough similarities here. I can recognize it. So essentially, the 12th house, one of the themes of it is transcendence. And this happens a little bit in the 11th house as well. So in the 11th house, we recognize that we are a part of humanity. People talk about the 11th house and Aquarius having this like detached humanitarianism, which is essentially like, I recognize that I'm just one person in this collective of people, and I care about the well-being of the collective and all of the individuals in it, because they're human, because they're part of the collective, and I care about everybody's well-being. But it's not in this emotional way, it's in a, well, Aquarius is an air sign, so it's in a very mental way, and it's fixed air, so fixed is stable and air is mental, so like, essentially belief systems, and just like ideas about like how society should be organized. But it's all with this idea of wanting the greater good for all of humanity, and recognizing that I, like everybody else, am just one person in the whole collective, and I'm like, we're all individuals, but none of us are like more special than anybody else. It's all, we're all human. So the 12th house takes it a step further than that. Like, I'm not just the part of this collective. Now we're talking about like the whole of existence. This is the universe, and not even just the universe. There's like everything that exists, and then there's the empty space within which it exists. And some really like higher expression 12th house or Pisces like gets the connectedness of all of it, and that the void is essentially holding space for existence. It's the, like, if you think of a bowl, it's the empty space inside of it that makes it useful. If you turn the bowl upside down and try to pour your cereal and milk into it, you're not going to have a very pleasant breakfast experience. So recognizing the void as something that is accepting and allowing, and allows existence to exist within it, can be a paradigm shift that makes the emptiness and isolation of the 12th house, which can be part of the 12th house experience, make it seem a lot more peaceful. Because as humans, we're biological in nature. We have bodies. We process things through this biological circuitry, and we don't want to die usually, or like sometimes parts of us want to die because life is so painful, and it seems better not to exist than to continue with whatever we've been doing. However, just as a general statement, we have self-preserving instincts as humans, and even dying in very painful situations is a form of self-preservation, because even though we might not know what's next, or might not think anything's next, or might have think we know what's next, but whatever it is we think it is better than what we're currently experiencing. So even that is a form of self-preservation. But setting that aside, our entire makeup, essentially, our entire like system of processing, our nervous system, and like all of our faculties are pretty hardwired to continue to survive. It's a thing that that life entails, a self-preserving instinct. And the void is kind of scary because it's like, but like nothing exists in the void. So it seems like if we like go into the void, it's going to swallow us up and we won't exist either. But really the void, is just holding space for us to exist and for everything else to exist either. So people who feel empty inside are actually kind of blessed, because they, despite how awful that feels, before you actually sit with the emptiness and experience it, these people, first of all, are going to have a drive to be spiritual seekers usually. And secondly, they have easier access to that emptiness, to the void. And once they do actually learn how to just be present with it and explore that emptiness inside of them, and even like try to like be the emptiness, then they discover that the emptiness that's inside of them is the same emptiness that's everywhere else. And it's the emptiness that holds the universe. So like you hear people say like the whole universe is inside of you. Yeah, like through the void, like, once you go into the void and can experience the void, you discover that the whole universe is there, which is a pretty awesome experience. So releasing everything, whether it's because you're giving up and surrendering, or because you're meditating and going into the stillness, the silence, the empty space, which is the void, and as it turns out is very, very peaceful, or any other way that people get there. Sometimes it's a near-death experience. Whatever the case, once they experience that, then I think they have a much greater experience of what the 12th house can be, what it entails, what it is, or like the higher expression of it. So then they can find, the whole universe there. And it's a very mystical experience. And like I said, then the next step from there is to go back into the first house. Now, even this can become something of escapism. It's called spiritual bypassing. So sometimes people will use, meditation and transcendence and, just being with the oneness as a way of not having to face the pain of their problems. And if you're doing this too much, then it can be a form of escapism, and it doesn't continue to, like, you can keep trying to do it, but it won't keep working. Because like I was saying earlier, if you're not actually to that point of surrender, like with the Serenity Prayer, that you're asking for the wisdom to know the difference between the things you can do something about and the things that you can't do something about. If you can still do something about it, you're not going to find that peace by trying to surrender it, because it just doesn't feel right. And my experience has been, if I'm not at peace with something, it means that I'm lying to myself in some way about it. Like I have some belief about it that's not true. There's some paradigm, some perspective that isn't accurate, or I'm fighting reality. I want it to be a certain way and it's not that way. And that's a very difficult experience. There's dissonance with it. I'm out of alignment. My inner world and outer world are not in alignment. So sometimes I ask myself, what if I'm not at peace with something? I ask myself, in what way am I lying to myself? Like, where's the lie here? And a lot of times I hear it in my head. As soon as I do that, I'm like, oh. And that can be a pretty big paradigm shift in itself, just having that experience. But if you're trying to release something and it's not time yet because you haven't done what you need to do to take care of the situation, what you can do, it's just not right. It's not going to it's not going to feel right, and you're not going to get peace from it, because the truth is not always pleasant. It's not always happy. It's not always enjoyable. But it does have a certain peace to it. And this is the peace that we can find with the 12th house sometimes. So for example, if I'm facing a situation that is just awful, it's just a terrible experience, and it feels like I have to do something about it. It also seems like there's nothing I can do, or no matter what I do, it's the wrong thing. It can seem like it's impossible to accept it. You don't actually need to accept the situation necessarily at that point. Just accept that you feel the way you do about it. You know, be present with that experience. And this again could be, or probably is, part of the relationship between the 8th house and the 12th house. Like, okay, so you can't accept the situation. That's okay. Accept that you can't accept the situation. If you can't accept that you can't accept the situation, then accept that you can't accept that you can't accept the situation. You know, like how whatever it is that you can accept, be with that, experience that, say, okay, this is what it is. And just be present with it. I wanted to say a bit more about oneness, because part of me enjoys talking about it, I suppose. But it's, in a way, it's kind of more of a Sagittarius thing, right? You know, like, that's all right. So an important part of the 12th house is recognizing that I'm not just me. So the poet Rumi, who was a Sufi mystic, has a whole lot of poetry about this. Like, it's like all of his poetry, essentially, almost all, if not all of it, has a 12th house theme to it. And it's about, you know, spiritual surrender and just experiencing life, just experiencing whatever you're experiencing. And one of the ways he put it is that I'm not a drop in the ocean, I'm the ocean in a drop. And water is like this. There isn't, you know, it's kind of like the void. Like, there isn't, you know, the void over here and the void over there. Like, it's the same void everywhere. Like, emptiness is emptiness. And water isn't the void, but it's always H2O, right? You know, like whatever, wherever it is, it's that. And, you know, you can freeze it or it can evaporate. But essentially, it's the same stuff wherever it is. It can be a solvent, or it can be contained for a time within something, but it's water. So every drop of water is water. You know, it's the ocean, you know, figuratively speaking. And we have this sense, you know, we're born when, like, wherever our ascendant is in our chart, that's our birth, essentially. And the first house is, you know, all about just like getting that start, and, you know, what we can do. You know, this is me, I'm here in this body, having this experience of this life. And, you know, what can I do? You know, I'm independent, I'm alone. You know, these are our first house themes. And, you know, feeling your own ability to act as an individual is what, you know, we do as humans in these bodies. You know, I can make this body move around, depending on how you define I, but we feel ourselves as individuals. And using our standard senses, we only have access to our own perspective, our own ability to process whatever it is we perceive. And even if we have like extrasensory perception, we're still processing it through our own faculties. So from our perspective, it looks like we're very separate from everything around us, but really we're not. You know, like our bodies, our moms essentially like built them inside their bodies of the food that they made, and you know, some other things. And then as we continue to eat throughout our lives, the food literally becomes our bodies. We're literally made up of earth and light. And when we expend energy, that can, you know, take off of, you know, the matter in or on our bodies. But our bodies are not just us. There's also, you know, all sorts of microorganisms within us that are extremely, extremely impactful to how we experience life and drive a lot of our behaviors, a lot more than most people would think. It's a very fascinating subject, but like our gut flora drives a lot of our, like our moods, our behavior, a lot of things. So there's that. There's the fact that like everything that we experience in life has an impact on us, and we have an impact everywhere we go, and even just being a part of the like field of consciousness on this planet and in this universe, like we are all constantly being impacted and also having an impact on those around us and our environment. Like if you hang out with the same person for a long time, usually you're going to start having like similar language, similar vocabulary when you talk about things. You know, you're adapting to each other. So despite our perception that, you know, like this is where I end, or like even if you're aware that you have an energy field like that's larger than your body, so like, you know, whatever it is that you perceive that to be, like let's say it's right here, even in that case, like you don't end right here, you know, like we're all a part of the kaleidoscopic dance of life, you know, like matter and energy changing forms, and it's all coming from and returning to the same source and then becoming other things constantly, you know. So like imagine it, you're looking through a kaleidoscope and turning it, and you know, it looks different over time as you turn it, but it's, you know, just the same thing changing forms essentially. And that's what we are, you know, we are life expressing itself in this moment as, you know, whatever it is we're experiencing. And you know, it keeps changing, keeps moving, and our bodies regenerate. Like it seems like we have an experience of continuity where, like, you know, I was born and I grew up, and, you know, I am essentially the same person yesterday or today that I was yesterday, but that's not really true. Like our bodies regenerate over time. Like if like my body is not the same body that I had in the past, it's different. So in the 12th house, we can experience ourselves not from our own perspective, or defining myself as me the way I have been, but transcending that to experience myself as the universe and as the kaleidoscope rather than one of the little pieces in it or one of the little like sections of it that changes shape over time. And it can be a very peaceful thing. Another thing that is very 12th house related is stuff like astral travel and interacting with other types of entities or on other planes. And all of this stuff, the transcendence, the visiting other planes, can be a really wonderful experience. But remember, this is just one house in the chart. And all of them are important. There are relationships with all of the houses, or like among all of the houses. And it's important to balance that out with appropriate focus on other houses too. So even like the 12th house also involves things like fantasy, fiction, dreams, and it can be difficult to see things clearly in the 12th house. Like you can't really define things very clearly. It's kind of like a dream that you're trying to remember, but it's fading. There's a certain fogginess and often like surrealism to it. It's why it's so mystical it's very mystical in nature at times, which is part of why it's like that. But in any case, it's an area where we may not see that part of our chart as clearly as other people do if it's somewhere else in their chart. So we can be prone to addictions in this area. Like, for example, my 12th house is in Capricorn, and I was a workaholic for like 2 decades, maybe more than 2 decades, without having any concept that I was. Like, I didn't even know it. And I was a workaholic that whole time, like since I was a teenager. So sometimes it can be helpful to get feedback from other people about our 12th house. However, remember that mysticism is about the experience. So trying to grasp anything too firmly when it involves Neptune or Pisces or the 12th house usually doesn't work out very, very well. You got to kind of just let it have that fluid, undefined, foggy surrealism to it. It's just the nature of the 12th house. So I'm going to go ahead and stop talking. And if anybody would like to ask anything, share anything, I would ask that we not just talk about like things that are individual to our charts. However, so like whatever signs, whatever planets, whatever's happening, like rather than focusing on that, focusing on the experience, whatever you're experiencing in your life that involves any of these themes. If there's anybody that would like to ask anything or share anything, I'm here. So is there anybody that would like to share anything? kind of had a feeling that there wouldn't be, which is okay. So I'm going to just go ahead and wrap this up then. All right. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you for coming.